When I picked up The Ghost of Saltmarsh, I had some idea of what I was getting myself into. I knew it was going to be an adventure anthology in the style of Tales from a Yawning Portal, that converted over some adventures from the old editions. I knew they would be nautically themed, there would be rules for ships, it would be loosely set in Greyhawk, and there would be Sahaugen. These were all new adventures for me. I hadn't really read any of them before, but I had heard some loose descriptions of the adventures ahead of time, and they sounded rather interesting. Overall, I was looking forward to the book, but my expectations were not through the roof. As it turns out, I was both positively surprised by what I found, and a little disappointed. So, let me break down this adventure book, and hopefully, I can give you guys an idea if it's something you want to pick up for your group. Oh, and I will be keeping the spoilers to a minimum. I won't discuss any of the plot points of the adventures, but I will be talking about some of the antagonists and some of the overarching structure and choices in the book. So like I mentioned, the book is very much an anthology of old adventures in the vein of Tales from the Yawning Portal. But it's also so much more. To call Tales an adventure anthology always felt a bit generous. I like the book, but it's mostly a collection of iconic dungeons from across the history of D&D. The Ghost of Saltmarsh, however, not only has the adventures, but right off the bat it impressed me with a great setting that was well fleshed out and compelling. When I first heard mention of the book, I heard its setting be described, and then it sounded like they had taken the city of Saltmarsh and plucked it out of Greyhawk, so you could place it in anywhere in any world. It's not really true, no. The town is definitely set in a nation in Greyhawk, and they describe a lot more of the surrounding lands than I had expected, but they've done it in such a way that you don't really need to know anything else about Greyhawk to be able to play in the setting. Ghosts is not a Greyhawk campaign guide, but it's the closest we have. And I'm going to say this again, that I've said several times as of late, the fact that they did not release a PDF campaign setting book of Greyhawk alongside the Ghost of Saltmarsh, like the one they released for Eberron, or opened up Greyhawk to the DM's Guild, is a damn shame and a huge missed opportunity. The first chapter not only describes the town of Saltmarsh and the surrounding lands, but also introduces an interesting set of NPCs and factions with distinct goals that are caught in a political struggle that could shape the whole region for generations to come. It has a bunch of small adventure ideas and seeds sprinkled in, and some really great integrated backgrounds. Not only does it offer ways to tie in and customize the backgrounds from the player's handbook into the setting itself, but the book also offers up several new backgrounds that are unique for the region. The region of Saltmarsh has everything a campaign needs. The town offers all kinds of services for adventuring groups, and there are whole regions to explore. Overall, the first chapter just blew me away. It made me excited for the idea of returning to Greyhawk, and I couldn't wait to see how the adventures would tie into this great campaign being offered. And this is where the disappointment started. You see, the first chapter offers some cliff notes on how we can tie the adventures into the bigger story of Saltmarsh, but the actual adventures are very much written as completely standalone stories, able to be dropped into any campaign. The overarching storyline presented in Chapter 1 is not integrated in any way into the adventures themselves. It's up to you as a DM to find a way to tie them in. This means that all the stories feel like side quests, and they don't really build upon each other. There's very little in the way of recurring NPCs, interesting characters, or returning locations. Even the 3 adventures that were originally written as a trilogy don't come off as being very connected. Yes, they build upon each other, and there's some definite foreshadowing within them, but they still don't feel very interconnected, and there's little in the way of consequences being carried over between the adventures. If you completely mess up one of the adventures, everything just sort of fixes itself in the next one so you can keep going. The adventures feel a lot like a chain, a series of connected but independent events, instead of being like a web, a mass of interconnected events that I had hoped that they would be. Now that being said, this doesn't mean that they're bad adventures. Some of these adventures were revolutionary when they were first written. A lot of them seem fairly challenging, and they deal with a lot of enemies and aspects of D&D that we haven't seen too much of in the current edition before now. I was happy to see Sahaugen in a prominent bad guy role. They are some of the more vile villains in D&D in my opinion, and I love using them. There's also a whole adventure that focuses on diplomacy, which was very much a welcome surprise. It's always nice to see a D&D adventure that rewards not just rushing in and killing everything. Also, expect to get a lot of use out of the underwater combat rules. I think about half of the adventures in the book have extensive underwater sections. The adventures are deeply flawed, however, in a few ways. Something that came up constantly, and which was a problem in Tales from Yawning Portal 2, is a lack of details. This applies to things like physical descriptions of monsters, motivations of characters, backstories of NPCs, and more. There's an abbey full of evil clerics, but no real mention of what they worship. There's a sea lion, which I assumed at first was a seal, but it can't be because it has claw attacks. Also, it's encountered locked in an underwater room, but apparently it can only hold its breath for 15 minutes. There's another cleric encountered in an adventure who is described as an inventor priest, but again no mention of what god he worships. There are countless of these moments throughout the adventure where you just pause and ask yourself, why is this creature here, or what is this NPC thinking? But there's just no explanation given. A lot of the time it feels like they cut out some of the details to make it easier for the adventures to be dropped into any setting and any ongoing campaign, but since many of the adventures are so clearly set in Greyhawk and have no issues referencing specific gods or nations, it just feels like they're unwilling to commit fully. To go back to the Inventor Priest as an example, it's no harder for us to replace the name of a god with one that is appropriate for our own setting than it is to fill a blank space where a god isn't mentioned, but it requires extra research on our part to find a god that fits in if nothing is mentioned. I know for instance that Gond is the god of adventures in Faerun, and I could easily make that priest into a Gondite if I were to run the adventure in Faerun. But I have no idea which god would be appropriate in Greyhawk. None of the gods I can think of seem to fit. And that is the assumed default setting for the adventure, so it would have been helpful if it just slipped in a name. Another critique I have of the adventures is that a lot of them just feel like locations or dungeons rather than adventures. And some of them also lack good hooks to get the players invested. The first adventure especially relies on the players just heading off to an abandoned house in the hope of finding treasure, knowledge, or evil to smite. This ties back into what I already talked about with the adventure not being tied very well into any sort of overarching storyline. And it's not unfixable in any way. As a DM, you can certainly find ways to tie the players into each adventure and make them more personal, and have them have lasting consequences on the group. I spent a few minutes leafing through the book after I had read it and thinking of ways to tie it all together tighter, and I came up with a handful of ideas of my own to do just that. I just wish there was more of that was already provided in the adventure. I'm not going to harp on the adventures anymore because I don't want to give too much of a negative impression of them. They are flawed, but ultimately they are fine. I can definitely see myself having quite a bit of fun with several of them, and so I think it's important to note the difference between thinking something is bad and being disappointed and wanting more from it. And perhaps more importantly, after the adventure comes the appendixes, and these are a treasure trove of lovely little things. First off, there are the rules for ships. There's a ton of these, not only rules for sailing and combat at sea, but also stats for many different types of ships, gear you can upgrade your ship with, and expanded rules for morale and crew. The rules seem very solid. I would have killed to have these rules back when I ran my Al-Qadim campaign set in the Crowded Sea. I can definitely see some use for these rules in the future of my games. There's also all kinds of rules for special phenomena and terrain you can encounter on or under the sea, and several random encounter tables for oceans, as well as a ton of tables to randomize everything from islands to crew names. This part definitely passed the inspiration test, because as soon as I started reading, I started having ideas of how to incorporate some of these events into my current games. There's also a list of adventure locations in this chapter, many of which I actually liked better than the actual adventures. These are maybe just a few pages long, but managed to pack in enough for several stories, and I especially liked how these locations had several different ideas for several different levels. For one, this meant that the location can be used for almost any group, but also you could use this to revisit the same location several times but offer different challenges each time. Of course, all of them aren't compatible, but I like the idea. Now you might think it weird that I'm showering the adventure locations with so much praise when I was so harsh at the adventures for feeling just like places without much of a connection to the story of a region. Well, I've already mentioned I liked some of these better than the full-size adventures, and some of them fit better into the Saltmarsh's overall narrative, but also these aren't meant to be full-size adventures. The adventures often cover 20 pages and still don't tell as interesting a story as these little vignettes. And then at the end, we of course have the bestiary. There are a ton of new, or rather old and updated, monsters in this book. I'm glad to see the return of some classics, such as the Lokafa and the Koalinth, but there's also a ton of variations and specializations of lizard folk, Sahaugen, and pirates. This book definitely has some great additions for anyone thinking of running a nautical campaign. Just be aware that, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these monsters are poorly described. So, my final thoughts. This is a flawed book. I still enjoyed it, and I'm glad I bought it, but it was not what I expected, and I think it could have been better. Something that caught me quite off guard was the lack of sailing and nautical adventure in this book. I was very much under the impression that a large portion of the campaign would focus on the players getting a ship, that would act as a mobile base for all kinds of exciting sea adventures, but no, that's not at all what it's about. Yeah, the players have the option to get themselves a ship, but it's neither required nor really recommended. Most of the adventures do not take place on the open sea, but in damp dungeons, and at some points having a ship might even take away from the adventure as it gives the players an easy out. I love the Greyhawk stuff, and the setting of Saltmarsh. There's definitely a ton of potential there. Almost none of the plot hooks introduced in the town tie into any of the pre-written adventures, but that does on the other hand leave a lot of unexplored and interesting ideas for a DM to build upon. There's also a whole lot of DM tools and rules that are great for any DM to have, so I think there's a lot of value in there. If you're looking for a pre-written campaign, I cannot recommend this book. It's not great as a campaign. If you want a pre-written campaign, go pick up Curse of Strahd. That being said, if you want a pre-made town to adventure out of with plenty of interesting ideas, but you're more interested in making your own campaign, and especially if you want something that isn't set in Faerun, then this is for you. The adventures are good to have for when you're struggling for ideas and want to throw in a pre-written adventure into your campaign. Every DM can use a couple of extra adventures on the shelf for a rainy day, so it's not like it hurts that they're included, just don't expect to play through them all. It's a book with a lot of flaws, but there's also a lot of great potential, and I for one am glad to have it in my collection. I'm curious if any of you have gotten the Ghost of Saltmarsh and what you thought of it. Also, are any of you big Greyhawk fans? And in that case, would you like them to give Greyhawk a PDF and open up the DM's Guild for a setting? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this review, why not give it a like and subscribe if you want to see more. If you want to support this channel, then please share this video on social media or with friends. It really helps out a lot. You can also follow me on Tumblr or Twitter or check out my DM's Guild page. I will add links to all of that in the description below. Until next time, Dungeon Delvers.